explain to us what we have to do mechanically, what we have to do to overwrite these programs of fear that are shutting down our capability for manifesting in a creative way.
So there's a 4-step process for that, which starts with raised awareness. So firstly, you have to understand what you've just said, which is that all the information you're being bombarded with is primarily negative, and that's going to have a cumulative effect on our own natural gearing to look out for the negative. So one of the things we could do is say, okay, I get very stressed out by the news. So maybe I'll limit my, reading or watching of the news. Obviously, we all need to stay informed, but we don't need to repeatedly hear the same bad news. So that's one thing. And then in that 4-step process, once we've raised awareness of whatever it is that we need to change, and it could be, something completely different for other people, the next step is focused attention, which is gathering data basically to back up your hypothesis that this is the way that I think sometimes, or this is the way that I behave in relationships, or this is why I never ask for a raise. And you don't change anything. You just really notice every time something like that happens. The next stage is deliberate practice, which is that you choose a new way of thinking or behaving that you use to overwrite your natural, the established way of thinking or behaving. Because in the brain, you can't undo something that's already there. You have to overwrite it until that new desired behavior becomes a stronger and more efficient pathway than the one you've had for your whole life. And the last part is, it's kind of, across the whole arc, is accountability. So we're not very good at holding ourselves accountable to major changes like this, because the efficiency of the brain will always want to go back to what's easier, which is what you've always been doing before. So sometimes you can use technology or journal, like apps that monitor your progress, or journaling to hold yourself accountable. But it's even better to have an accountability partner or a coach or somebody that, makes sure that you keep progressing and you don't give up when the going gets tough, because it can feel for a long time like nothing's changing, but there's a lot of work going on in the brain. So you mentioned the difference between the mind and the brain. When people think about doing psychological work, like improve my emotional intelligence or manifest my dream partner, there's actually neurons and synapses connecting up. And, this takes a drain on your body. It makes you more hungry. It makes you need to sleep more, because it's just like doing a workout at the gym. And so there can come a point where you feel that you're more drained, but nothing's actually changed yet, that you want to give up. So motivation and patience are a huge part of the journey. There's that kind of really classic picture of a man that's digging for gold, and we can see that it's 1 meter away, but he's been digging for so long that he's ready to give up.
Yes. So let's talk about that. I mean, certainly there have to be studies about how long it takes on average, and everybody's different. Everyone's brain is different. But on average, say a person says, well, geez, I've meditated for a week on what I want and nothing's happened. So let's get real about how long it takes to actually overwrite the old program.
It definitely does matter what it is. So if it's something like, I want to get into doing some form of exercise 3 times a week, then I could see most people achieving that in a few weeks. If it's something like emotional intelligence, improve my emotional intelligence or find my life partner, that could take 9, 10, 12 months. So it does depend on the difficulty of the task. But on average, to embed a new habit in your brain so that it's overwritten the old one and it's actually become, embedded in your brain and now the way that you behave, takes just over 2 months.
Okay, interesting. So give it a good 60 days. Let's talk about what you just mentioned a moment ago, because that's a really good point. If we decide we want to go to the gym because, we're ready for a fitness program to get in better shape, and endurance, whatnot, that's solo. We have the choice over that. That's our own motivation and what we choose to do. When we're talking about attracting a partner in our life that's appropriate to meet the needs that we have at this time, that's not solo. That there are so many moving parts and other players and streams and possibilities, timelines and such, that another person or another potential partner can hop in. Something happens, they get sick, they hop out, and then this whole unseen system of magnetism and desire is happening unbeknownst to us. Can you tell us what that looks like from a brain-mind point of view? What we have to do to sustain that, as you say, to bring something this complex about?
I'd like to go back to something you said, which connects to this, which is, I've meditated on this for a week, but nothing's happened. So the first thing I'm going to say is that it cannot be about sitting at home, creating a fantasy vision and not doing anything to make it come true. There has to be action involved. You can meditate for as long as you like, but your dream partner is not going to just walk through the door because you've been thinking about them. So it starts with an abundant mindset. So, the first barrier is whether you think that this can happen or not. And so you have to get into a state where you feel worthy, deserving, optimistic. You've given yourself examples either from your own past or, in your social circle, that this is absolutely possible. The second part is what I call magnetic desire, which is that you have the positive emotion that is going to keep your motivation through potential periods of time where it feels like nothing's changing. And so that depends on you being so aligned in your thinking, your emotions, and your gut that there's no wavering from that. So if it's, if you think, in my heart, I'd love to meet someone, but logically, I may be too old, or, I don't know anyone that's available, then you're already starting to misalign on those. So it has to be, this is what I know I want logically. I feel very strongly in my heart that I deserve that.
And that's the key.
Yeah, it's absolutely key. And if that's an issue, you need to dig below the negative thought that's kind of like, well, maybe that's never going to happen for me. You need to dig below that and understand what you believe about yourself that is making you think that might not be possible. So, it's hard work. It's really...
Well, it is. It's complex. Yeah. It's excavation of layers, because we also have familial ancestral patterns and traumas that have been literally we've incarnated with. You could even take it further and say past life trauma or situations. And so getting to that clear point of magnetic desire where you absolutely believe you can have this, that everything in you deserves to have this beautiful experience. I hope you're enjoying this video, because if you are, there are dozens more like it on my site, all supported by people like you. So if you'd like to keep this work rolling in and join our community, just click on the Patreon button at reginameredith.com. That also gives you access to insider commentary, my live book club, and other live events with special guests. So join in. Thanks. How would you tell a person to handle that when they have sabotaging deeper belief systems, unconscious patterns?
I think there's a bit of a spectrum for that. So for some people, journaling and introspection may help them to understand what's driving that. But for some people, and especially if time isn't on your side, then, having a psychotherapist or, a psychologically trained coach could absolutely accelerate that process. And sometimes it's examining, the family dynamics that were present in your childhood, your experience of relationships, like your parents' relationship, the relationships that you see in the people around you. But really, it is about digging below the thought, the doubt that you have, to what you believe about yourself that makes that true, and then creating a positive affirmation that's the opposite of that statement, and repeating that so many times that it overwrites the negative belief that's existing in your brain.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, because this is not as simple as doing a vision board. Although you and I have both done plenty of vision boards, and you can have miracles occur. So let's take that into the extension of visualization, why and how it does work, and also why and how it doesn't.
So I actually call them action boards because, again, I believe that, yes, you can create the vision, but you do have to be out there trying to make it come true, not just waiting for it to come true. But with visualization, it is very, very powerful in the brain because the brain doesn't like uncertainty. So anything new is a threat to the brain. So simply by visualizing the outcome that you want, you are preparing your brain for that kind of scenario so that it won't be as afraid of that scenario occurring. And I have a few additional steps that I add for visualization that really help, which are that you visualize, you either look at your vision board or you close your eyes and visualize whatever it is that you want. You believe that it has already become true. And then you give gratitude for the fact that it came true. So what that does is gratitude is on the other end of the spectrum from fear. So love, trust, gratitude, they correlate with the bonding hormone oxytocin. And oxytocin and cortisol are in a balance. So if you are producing more oxytocin by giving gratitude, then naturally your cortisol levels are going to reduce, but also you'll shift from fear to trust and bonding, which is what oxytocin is about. So that means you lower your guard, which isn't a bad thing because often our guard is up too much, that you're warm and receptive to opportunities, and you're more likely to take healthy risks that are likely to pay off to big rewards than avoid that because you're afraid of the potential loss.
And yet people then paint themselves as kind of dreamers and fools because they dare go into a scenario where they can feel that this amazingly wonderful experience has already occurred and giving gratitude for it when it hasn't happened yet. So the logical mind, overcoming that logical part of the mind for so many people is such an ordeal. You have a very logical mind. Tell them how they might negotiate with themselves to give themselves permission to have the bigger dream.
Because I've been through that process myself, so I'm not just talking about it as a neuroscientist. I'm really speaking from experience. And the way that I rationalized it to myself as a scientist is that if I act on the basis that this really could come true, I'm more likely to behave in the real world and notice and grasp opportunities that are related to that than if I sit at home telling myself it's never going to come true.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense. So now let's talk about the absolute need. If we're going to go into this dreaming, to this magnetic desire, to this process of creation, how important it is to allow our brain to be able to move into a receptive mode, like just kind of goofing around, reading fiction, this sort of thing. What happens to the brain when we set it free like that and allow it to relax versus being hypervigilant all the time?
Lovely question. So there's two parts to that question from the science. One is that when we indulge in creative activities, so either reading a novel, going to the theatre, listening to certain types of music, then it actually increases the connectivity between the left and the right halves of the brain. So it makes that bridge between the two halves more active. And as I said at the start, the more we can associate different parts of the brain working together, the more potential we're getting out of our brain. But then, and because you've mentioned the word dreaming, I just want to say that it can't be an unrealistic fantasy. It has to be something that, you know, if you're looking for something in a partner, then that you have similar things to offer, you know, so that we're not all saying that we want to sit here and meet somebody that's just so like crazily different to us in our life that then we're just going to create another failure. So it's got to be something that you can actually make come true. And then there's another thing about the brain, which is super, super important, which is intention. So the intention with which you do certain things makes a completely different result for the outcome. So I'll give you a physical example first, and then I'll give you a more emotional one. So intermittent fasting, let's just take a really basic version of that, which is people that only eat between 12 noon and 8 p.m. So they essentially fast for 16 hours overnight. When that's intentional, it has all sorts of health, weight, and longevity benefits. When it's because you're so stressed and busy and not taking care of yourself that you just skip meals, like, you just forget to have breakfast, or you don't, you wait till you're absolutely starving before you have lunch at 3 p.m., the outcome is totally different.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you then, another example of that is the difference between intentional mind wandering and daydreaming. So if you're sitting at the desk and you find that you just lost focus and your mind went elsewhere, that's not a very good sign about your brain. But if you do take the time to sit or be in nature and just let your mind wander, then what you do is you move the activity in your brain from what's called the control network, which is the task focus network, to the default network or the default mode, which is that open to possibility, flexible, thinking outside of the box, kind of more creative part of the brain. And so it makes sense that if you go out into the outside world, whether it's to work or social setting, having had your brain in default mode for a while, you're going to notice things that you wouldn't have noticed if you're completely task focused. You're going to see patterns where they're not obvious. You're going to join the dots where you may not have.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you might also want to consider joining Patreon, which allows me to keep all of this content free and available to everyone. And if you're looking for like-minded souls, you might also enjoy my online community called Our Neighborhood. Links to join are in the description.